So today I'm going to be presenting on the latest trends in giving to religion and share some highlights from the Giving USA 2025 report. So first I'm going to be telling you a little bit overall about Giving USA. Then I will be sharing some of the high-level findings from the report, so some of the general trends we're seeing on giving overall. And then I'm going to go into some of the religion chapter highlights and talk about some themes that we saw and highlight some specific pieces of data that I think tell us a little bit more about some of the broader trends that are emerging in religious giving. So first, a little bit about Giving USA. This is a report that goes really into wonderful depth about current trends across all giving sectors, including to religious organizations. For the purposes of Giving USA, religious organizations include congregations, religious media, missions, but it excludes religiously motivated or inspired organizations operating in other sectors. And part of the reason for that is that it can be difficult to identify those specific organizations. So this report is researched and written by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy here at IU Indianapolis, which Lake Institute is part of. And I myself wrote the most of the religion chapter, and you can see in the chapter there's also some contributions from the research team at the school as well as a few others with the Giving USA Foundation. And the Giving USA Foundation has actually been publishing this report for 40 years now. This, I believe, is the 40th anniversary of publication. So what's really exciting in some of our overall statistics is that we're actually able to look back at 40 years worth of trends in giving. So next I'm going to share a little bit about some of these general trends that we saw in 2024 in giving. So generally, giving is up by 6.3%. After that's adjusted for inflation, that's 3.3%. And so overall giving has been increasing in the US. Total charitable giving reached $592.5 billion in 2024. And also individual giving also went up and even at a higher rate than overall giving. So that increased by 8.2%, which is about 5.1% as adjusted for inflation. And finally, religious giving, since that's our specific topic, that increased by 1.9%. But unfortunately, after adjusting for inflation, it represents a slight decline of 1%. So I'll be talking shortly about some of the sectors and explaining some of the different trends that we're seeing there. So while religion, well, even though it increased, it decreased slightly relative to inflation, it still remains the largest giving sector. And in fact, all contributions to all these sectors did increase, although after adjusting for inflation, religion was the only sector that showed a slight decline. So you can see here religion is just under 23% in 2024 for contributions. After that, you can see human services, that's at about 14%. And similarly, education, very slightly lower dollar value, but also at 14%. And then as you go around this pie chart, you can see the other sectors in giving to that. And the smallest amount has been going to environment and animals, that's 3%, although as you'll see in our next chart, that's actually been increasing slightly over time. So now we're going to get into a little bit of giving to religion and a little bit on the historical trends where we see a decline in giving to religion in the overall share of giving. So this is, again, one of the benefits of Giving USA being in its 40th year is we see some data here back to the mid-1980s. And so you can see over this trajectory, religious giving started out being over 50%. It was 56% of giving between 1985 and 1989. And gradually, it's become a slightly smaller share to where we are currently in the 2020 to 2024 period. It's now about a quarter of all giving. But what's happening in conjunction with this trend is that we're seeing, some growth in other areas. So for instance, in the same time, human services has actually grown quite a bit. So that started in the single digits back in the 80s and into the 90s. And Now, human services, this year was 14% overall from 2020 to 2024, that it's been 13%. And then, as I mentioned, we have some areas that were a very small slice of giving back in the 80s and 90s, such as international affair and environment and animals, that are also slowly growing. And some of the sectors here, education's actually been fairly consistent between about 11 to 14%. But you can see all the details of all these different sectors for giving. But even as religion declined, I would note that religion still does substantially remain the largest area of giving where giving is received. So let's look a little bit at this on the individual level. So this chart shows us giving as a percentage of disposable personal income. And the way this is defined for this chart is the income that is available after taxes have been paid. And of course, this is tied to total household income, which is a main determinant of how much households give. And so you can see the trend here over since 1984. This proportion's been somewhere between 1.7%, I believe, was the low to, and that was, I think, in um, uh, 1995 or so, and the highest levels would have been around 2.4%, which was hit at 2005. Currently, we're on the lower side of that at 1.8%. Although interestingly, I would note that's not far off from where this chart started, and you can see it's actually gone back and forth in the percentage throughout the 40-year time span that this represents. So the last overall trend that I wanted to share with you is the number of 501c3 organizations in the US. So this is looking at a 10-year time frame. So these are generally the nonprofits in the US. And overall, we've seen an increase. It was around 1 million in 2013. Now this has increased to about 1.5 million. And the annualized rate of increase has been about 3.7%. Between 2022 and 2023, the growth was closer to 2.3%, so it was a little slower compared to overall. But as you can see, this changes a little bit over time, and the general trend has been towards growth in the nonprofit sector. So now that we've gone over some of the major overall trends that we've seen, I'm going to talk about some specific examples from the religion chapter. So in the religion chapter, in addition to the overall highlights, we discuss a lot of the individual research findings that we've seen on giving over the past year. And one of these reports came from the Mortar Stone and Infinity Concepts and Gray Matter research. So their report looked at giving to congregations, and they found that the median giving to congregations declined from $910 in 2021 to $600 in 2024. So this I took as an example of some of the changes we're seeing in individual giving. Now, if it's been a minute since you've taken statistics, the median is if you take all of the numbers and you line them up in a row, and then you take the middle number, that's what the median is. It's actually the middle number. And this is often used, especially when you're dealing with money and you may have some really high values on one end or low values on the other end that can affect what your average is. But the median, and so in that case, the median tells you a little bit more about what could be the typical experience. So I mention this because the next bullet point you'll see on the slide is that while median giving to congregations per household declined, the median giving among the top 1% of givers increased 47% from 2021. So this suggests to me that we actually see a couple of different patterns in congregational giving from this study. While it may be declining for the average individual household, for the top 1% of households, it's actually increasing quite a bit. And another interesting piece of data from the study was that they found that giving among evangelical Protestants in the US declined both in amount and frequency between 2020 and 2021, which is perhaps not surprising given the decline in median. And they also found 1/3 of evangelical Christians did not contribute to their church. So this is just one example of research that we found on looking at one particular faith group, but we also see some reflections of these trends across some of the other faith groups that we've been examining through this work. So next I'm going to look a little bit about some of the highlights we found in changes to congregational giving. And in this particular slide, I'm highlighting some of the findings we had from the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations, also known as EPIC report, which is out of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. And this is from their Faith and Finances report that Lake actually helped to contribute to. So one of the big findings from this is that they did see that congregational income has overall increased, but it's not increasing at the pace of inflation. And I think this is really critical to think about because while we, see that gifts are increasing, it's likely that given the pace of inflation, that a congregation's expenses are probably exceeding what a congregation is bringing in if that's growing faster than what the giving is. So I think that's something that has the potential to really impact congregations in the local level. Something else I think is important to highlight from this report is that while 80% of the average congregation's budget comes from participant donations, 1/3 of congregations rely exclusively on participant contributions for funding. And particularly when we see fluctuations from inflation and also some of the general congregational trends I'll be talking about more in a moment, where we see, on average, across all faith groups, participation in congregations is declining. That means there are fewer people who are having to make up a larger amount of and growing amount of expenses for their local congregation. Though there is, I think, something really hopeful here for congregations, and that in this study, which actually supports findings even pre-pandemic we've had with faith communities today, fact surveys, that congregations that offer online giving tend to receive higher per capita income. And from this particular study, we actually saw that the more a congregation emphasized online giving, actually the higher their per capita income was. So while congregations are obviously facing some challenges in giving, there are some ways that we see where congregations are maybe able to overcome some of those challenges, at least through offering online giving. So the next area of trends I wanted to highlight are some of the findings we had in changes in religious identity and practice. A study from PRI found that between 2013 and 2023, the proportion of religiously unaffiliated Americans rose from 21% to 26%. And this is particularly notable because of all the other largest religious groupings of Americans, affiliation actually dropped. And so in some smaller groups, we did see increases, but generally, people are becoming less affiliated with different religious groups. Also, from a Pew study, looking specifically at American Christians, we found that the proportion of Americans identifying as Christian was at 62% in 2023 and 2024 from their study. And this is notable because not too long ago, that number was a bit higher. It was 71% in 2014 and 78% in 2007. And a lot of that is likely impacted by this rate of disaffiliation in the US. Another Pew study found that membership in a house of worship has declined to 45% in 2023. So it's not just identity that's declining, it's also actual membership. And a lot of these membership declines appear to really have happened mostly in the past 20 years. So that membership number was at 73% back when they started measuring it in 1937. And I'm sorry, this might actually, I think this is data from Gallup. I apologize. And this is at 70% in 1999. We're also seeing, similar to membership, religious service attendance is declining generally for Christian groups, but it's actually increasing among Muslim and Jewish Americans. So this is a good reminder, I think, when we're looking at our data, that while we see some overarching trends, there's a lot of little pieces that make up some of these trends, and some of them actually go in different directions, and there's quite a few nuances to consider when looking at the data. Finally, from a Gallup study, we also saw that 80% of Americans report feeling that religion's role in American life is diminishing. And that's probably not surprising given some of the trends that we just discussed above. People are not religiously identifying, they're not becoming religious members as often, and they're not religiously participating quite as often. Now, I know I just went over some data that I think can be a little bit challenging. So I also wanted to share some things that I find as sources of hope. So even though we see these numbers where the share of giving to religion is declining, we're seeing declines in participation, we're seeing some declines in certain areas of religious giving. I think it's helpful to remember that amidst all of this, religion still remains the largest slice of the giving economy, and that giving to religious organizations continues to be a priority for millions in the US. So while religious giving is a smaller proportion of what it had been 40 years ago, or even 10 or 20 years ago, it's still the biggest proportion and by quite a bit. So this is still it's still important and still something obviously we're going to continue to study. And so I think this is, religious giving, while it's changing, it's still very much present in American life. Another thing that I mentioned a few slides ago is that online giving has become a way for congregations to increase their giving income overall. And like I said, this has been certainly true since the pandemic, but like I said, we actually saw this in data prior to the pandemic from faith communities today. So this seems to be something that's fairly robust. And it's another way to help people be able to have different ways of giving. I know there's some really excellent conversations to be had around what happens whenever people aren't physically passing a plate or engaging in giving in more tactile ways. But I think that, obviously this is an avenue potentially for growth in giving for congregations. And finally, something that I wrote about in the Giving USA chapter that I found really exciting is that we're seeing some congregations pursuing innovative strategies around their buildings and around their community presence. We find congregations are engaging in new community partnerships. A lot of it, in some places, has been around affordable housing. But I think these community partnerships are really essential for thriving congregations, regardless of the size of a congregation. But also within these partnerships, we're seeing new opportunities for sources of revenue, and for ways for congregations to maybe use spaces in their building that they hadn't been using very much, or maybe its purpose has changed. Now the building has new life. There might be new people using parts of the building, and it can be a way for a congregation to be more sustainable, even in the midst of declining attendance and increased costs.